Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kate. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a staff member with Leadnow. I'm a digital organizer. And I'm based on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh in what's now known as Vancouver. And I have been doing climate work, climate campaigning for almost a decade. I started in high school. With a campaign against the Enbridge pipeline, and since then have been involved in climate strikes, in the divestment movement, in the movement for a Green New Deal. And so I'm very, very excited to be here with all of you talking about how we effectively lobby and practice advocacy with our elected officials. And I'll also just say I have just like such love and respect for our kids and the work that all of you do, and just profound respect for anyone who is doing this work while also parenting. So yeah, thank you to all of you for all the work you do. Before we jump in, I would just love to get a bit of a sense of the experiences and the knowledge that already exists in this group. So I'm wondering if you've ever participated in an MP meeting or a meeting with a city councillor or any elected representative. Could you just drop an exclamation mark in the chat? Okay, yeah, seeing tons and tons of them rolling in. That's amazing. That's so cool to see. Yeah, very excited to draw from the collective knowledge that exists on this team already. And then can you drop a star like this in the chat if you've ever hosted an MP meeting? So if you were the one leading the charge. Okay, yes. So I think I think what this shows me is that we all probably have a lot more to teach each other than I have to teach any of you. And so I'm really excited for the panel discussion with some For Our Kids members who have hosted MP meetings and to dig into that together. So what I'm going to be covering over the next 30 minutes or so is a bit of an introduction to why you might meet with your elected representative, and then how to pick a strategic target and be strategic in the kind of meeting that you run. And then some of the building blocks of how to run an effective advocacy meeting. And if at any point you're feeling like it's too service level or it's moving too fast, feel free to give me live feedback in the chat, and we can speed up or slow down based on where the group's energy is. So to kick us off, just want to ground us in like a little bit of a sense of why we might want to meet with our elected representatives. And I think this is something that's very context dependent and depends on your strategy and the issue that you're campaigning on. I will also say it can feel a little hard to talk about how to run advocacy meetings without being attached to a specific issue, because all of this is going to be dependent on your context. But some of the reasons you might meet with an elected representative include bringing an issue to their attention or asking them to take a specific action. It might be to show your elected representative that an issue matters to their constituents, or to force them to publicly pick a side on an issue. And the strategy behind meeting with your elected representative will change based on the context and how friendly or hostile they are to your cause. So here are the steps for planning a meeting. First, you're going to want to identify your target and your strategy, and we'll dig into all of these in more depth. You're going to want to plan your meeting. So this is the step where you figure out what your talking points are, who's going to be there, and what your strategy is if they say yes to your demand or say no to your demand. You're going to ask for a meeting, and step 2 or 3, the order doesn't matter so much. As some of you probably know, asking for a meeting can be a very long, drawn-out process. You're going to host your meeting, and you're going to debrief after the meeting. And again, we'll go through all these steps in a bit more detail. So first off, identifying your target. So most of the time, your target will be the elected representative who has jurisdiction over your issue. And that could be either a city councillor, an MLA or an MPP, or an MP. We also, senators are potential targets, but that's something that I personally have less experience with. So if anyone here does, would love to hear you share a little bit more about that. And then if your issue spans multiple jurisdictions, or if your group has access to more than one representative, so for example, if your group is based in Toronto and you have lots of MPs or MPPs to pick from, you can be strategic about who you choose to meet with based on who you feel has the most influence on your issue. So to dig into that a little bit more, the most important thing when planning an advocacy meeting is to ask yourself, who has the power to affect the change you want? So depending on the issue, this can be a really simple or a really complicated question to answer. It could be straightforward. So if you want a new bike lane in your city, it could be, you just meet with your city councillor. Or if you might be looking to meet regarding a pipeline project that falls under both provincial or federal jurisdiction, you might want to consider meeting with both your provincial or your federal representatives, or consider targeting just one, but making sure you have an idea of what might be in their power to deliver. And it's also really important to note that the person with the most recognized authority, so for example, a high-ranking cabinet minister, is not always the most strategic target for an advocacy meeting. And I know Anne, who's one of the presenters we're going to be hearing from later, is in the process now of trying to set up a meeting with Chrystia Freeland that's been many months in the making. Chrystia Freeland holds so much power that she is going to make herself really unavailable to the public. And also, because of how much power she holds and how entrenched that power is, meeting with her on her own might not be enough for her to shift her position on a policy or on an issue. So when figuring out who to target, if you have the option to, try to think about who has the power to affect the change you want in more expansive terms. So maybe instead of trying to meet with Chrystia Freeland, you could, as Leadnow volunteers just did, meet with 20 backbencher Liberal MPs who might be open to learning more about the policy, and then potentially even supporting it in caucus meetings or in the House of Commons, or by trying to get the ear of cabinet ministers like Chrystia Freeland. So as much as you can, thinking about who has power, but also who you have access to and who is likely to shift in their position. And then my last invitation in terms of figuring out who has the power to affect the change you want is to consider who has influence outside the governing party. So for example, last year, Leadnow did a series of phone banks in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, who were being subjected to violence from the RCMP. And the RCMP raids had been requested by the BC NDP and authorized by the federal government. But when we were trying to figure out who to target, we decided that we were actually going to target the federal NDP. And the reason we did this is because we knew the federal NDP was trying to avoid doing damage to their relationship with the BC NDP by staying silent on Wet'suwet'en. And we knew that if they were forced to speak out, it might damage the BC NDP's reputation and set a precedent for the federal NDP to stand up to their provincial counterpart if they committed similar atrocities in the future. So as much as you're able to, think expansively about who has influence on your issue and what the webs of influence are, and then what's kind of sitting at that intersection of influence and movability and access. And I'll also just note that this information can sometimes be hard to find. So feel free to experiment and research and play around with, who is available to you, and how they might be able to have an impact on your issue. And another useful tool for figuring out who might be a strategic target is the spectrum of allies, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Um, there's a lot of reasons that a politician might not be actively campaigning on your issue or being the champion that you might want them to be. It might be that they're overwhelmed. It might be that the party that they belong to has set out other priorities, and your issue just hasn't made it into the top few. It might be that they haven't heard about the issue before, because a lot of the time policies are being developed that elected representatives only really hear about when it's time to make a vote on them. So often your elected representative just won't have a lot of awareness about the issue. They might not be educated on it. They might not feel like it's a priority, or they might not be convinced that their constituents care about it. So there's lots of reasons why an elected representative might not be championing your issue yet, but it's really helpful to identify where you think they fall on the current spectrum of allies. So are they an active opposition? Are they like a hardcore conservative who's like never going to touch the emissions cap? Or are they neutral? Are they like a liberal MP who just hasn't really heard about it and isn't sure, like what to do about it? And so figuring out where your elected representative falls on the spectrum of allies will have implications for the kind of lobbying that you do and the tone of your meeting. And then finally, it's really helpful to figure out what motivates your MP and then how you can leverage that to get what you want. So, for example, someone like Chrystia Freeland doesn't really fear not getting reelected. She's in a very safe liberal riding. She's not afraid of her constituents, but she does fear for her reputation because she's someone who's in line to potentially become the new leader of the federal Liberals. She really wants to be making a good impression at all times. So maybe meeting with Chrystia Freeland might involve tactics that are angled a little bit more at hurting her reputation than trying to make her into your friend. And then a good framework for this, again, something probably many of you are already familiar with, is the concept of a theory of change. So if we do X, then Y will happen because Z. So with the example of the Wet'suwet'en phone banks, if we target federal NDP MPs and ask them to stand up to the BC NDP, then they might, then the BC NDP might back away from their raid on Wet'suwet'en territory because their reputation will be damaged. So just making sure that there's some coherence in terms of who you're targeting and why. So just a couple examples of what this could look like. Say you're meeting with someone who is with you, so they're like generally supportive of your issue, and they have some influence on your issue too. So an example of this could be a sympathetic Liberal MP who we might be meeting with to discuss the emissions cap. If you're meeting with someone like this, you can come into that meeting in good faith, and the point of the meeting can be to try to turn that MP, MLA, MPP, whatever, into your friend and ally. So you can have a friendlier tone, you can give them an ask that is achievable for them because you are acting on the assumption that they might actually be able to follow through on it. And then you can reward them by, taking nice photos with them and showing them that you are supporting them in taking the good action that you want them to take. If your elected representative is someone who has influence on your issue, and with all these examples, you'll notice that they're all on the north end of having influence on your issue, because I would say I would avoid meeting with people who don't have influence on your issue. So if they have influence on your issue, but it's not clear if they're with you or if they're against you, if they're kind of in the middle, you can take on a little bit of you can try to force them to pick a side. And a good example of this is an MP meeting I was a part of in high school, where we met with now BC NDP Premier David Eby to try to get him to take a stance on thermal coal in the province. And so we met with him. We presented him with a pledge that said, "I commit to stop new thermal coal exports in BC." We asked him to sign it. He refused to do so. And then we took a picture outside of his office with the unsigned pledge and another sign that said, "My MP refused to sign this." So there's an option if you're meeting with someone whose allegiance is unclear, to force that allegiance into question and try to get them to pick a side. If you're meeting with someone who has influence on your issue but is against you, you can do something like this. I'm curious if anyone has seen this action before. Cool. Gabrielle, do you want to describe it to us? Maybe I won't play it, but if you just want to describe what's going on here, that would be great.
Well, I can't remember what this representative's name is, but this group of children confront her about a stance, and she is quite defensive. And I feel like it's very effective to film it and show sort of how she's, she comes across as very unempathetic. And I think it became kind of a social media phenomenon for that reason, and exposed sort of her lack of empathy and her lack of engagement on the issue.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, and if you haven't seen this, I would definitely recommend watching it because it's like just a case study in like the most condescending you could be as a politician. Yeah, and it's Dianne Feinstein, a California senator. And what was so brilliant about this tactic is it was pretty clear that Dianne Feinstein wasn't going to champion the Green New Deal, which is what they were meeting with her to talk about. But they met with her anyway, and they used it as an opportunity to turn the public against her, and to polarize the public against her so that she looked like the enemy. So you'll notice the more people fall on that spectrum of having influence and also being against you, the less you have to play the game of, like getting them to commit to soft, achievable things, like being nice in meetings, being respectful. And the more you can lean into tactics that are designed to call them out and turn the public against them. So the more you're kind of engaging in theater with the meetings, as opposed to good faith conversations like you might do with someone who you think might be willing to be on side with you. And then another example of this. So we've got someone at like the far end of the spectrum in terms of being against you and having influence on your issue. This is a photo from a climate justice Toronto meeting that started as a meeting with Carolyn Bennett during the Shutdown Canada movement in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en. She was really condescending. She was really disrespectful. And so Indigenous youth occupied the office for 24 hours until they got another meeting with Carolyn Bennett, and then continued to insist that she speak out in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, which was something they knew she would never do. But the point of that wasn't to get a commitment from her. It was to communicate to the public how inadequate the federal government's response had been up until that point. So again, the farther you go along that spectrum, the more you can engage in theater as opposed to good faith negotiation or conversation with your elected representative. And that's your call to make in terms of where you think your elected representative falls on this spectrum, and then what strategy matches up with what you think is possible to get out of that person you're meeting with. Okay, so moving on to some of the nuts and bolts of getting a meeting. Again, I think probably many of you have had experience with this. great basic starting point is you're always going to want to send an email identifying yourself as a constituent and then follow up via phone, often many times. And the name of the game here is persistence and follow up. And again, I'll put Anne Curie on the spot, who's been trying to get a meeting with Christia Freeland for, I think, 4 months at this point. How many phone calls have you left?
Oh gosh. I mean, emails and phone calls, probably like 5 phone calls, 6 phone calls, and just continual follow-up emails. Nice responses from her constituency officer, but yeah, we're still back and forth, back and forth. I need to ramp up the phone calls, I think.
Yeah, and hopefully that won't be your experience all the time. Again, the more high-ranking an elected representative is, the harder it is to get in touch with them. But MPs get a lot of emails, they get a lot of phone calls, and they have a lot of people demanding their time. So persistence is the name of the game. Your elected representatives actually have an obligation to meet with you because you're their constituent. So it's regarded really badly if they say no to you, but they might stonewall you. So follow up, follow up, follow up, and then if you're receiving like persistent stonewalling from your elected representative, some backup tools that you can try that some of our volunteers have tried with our latest MP meeting campaign around the emissions cap has been starting a petition or an open letter addressed to your elected representative and signed by people in your riding asking for them to meet with you. You can also, if you're social media savvy, you can like call them out on Twitter publicly. And then the last resort, which I'll share kind of sparingly because this isn't something that you would do unless it really was a last resort, is you can contact their party whip, whose information is publicly accessible, and let them know, hey, like my MP has been refusing to meet with me for X many months. I've like contacted them this many times, blah, blah, blah. And they might like go over your MP's head basically and like tell them they need to meet with you. And then the other note of caution I'll say around asking for a meeting is sometimes with MPs that are harder to get, you might get constituency assistants saying, well, like the MP is really busy, like you can't meet with them, but you could meet with me. And that's something that's, it's up to you whether you accept that or not. But really, the point of an MP meeting is to get something out of your MP or to communicate something to your MP or to tell a story about your MP. And that's just not going to happen if you're meeting with a constituency assistant. So if you feel comfortable, if that's offered to you, feel free to say no and just continue to push for that meeting with your elected representative because it's what you're owed. And then this is something where like, you can decide how you feel about it based on your own moral compass. But MPs are much more willing to meet with you if you're in the riding. But, maybe if your group is based in Toronto and there's many different ridings in Toronto, and some of you are from outside the riding, you don't have to tell your MP that. You can also lie and say you are in the riding. If you have any connection to the riding at all, you can pull on that. Not endorsing, like not telling you have to do that, but if you feel comfortable, it is a great way to kind of up your legitimacy a little bit. Before I move on, does anyone else have any other like tips or tricks for getting a meeting with your MP if this has been a point of struggle for you?
I could just add here, I have a good relationship with my MPP, who is Jessica Bell, and she recently offered to help our group get a meeting with Christia Freeland. And I also recruited our former councillor, Mike Layton, to the group, and that got me a phone call back. So just continuing to build that pressure. Yeah.
Oh, that's such good advice. That's so smart. Yeah.
I want to second that. We've developed a relationship with our MP, who's not a high-profile Liberal, but she has the ambition to get there, and so she was able to get us meetings with environmental committee members, even though we didn't necessarily have a presence in those ridings. So I know that we have that emissions reduction thing coming up, and there are certain MPs we want to target. This is also a way that we could potentially get meetings with MPs where we may not have a presence.
Yeah, that's great. Thinking about who does have leverage over your MP and who they might respect more than you, and using that connection if you can is really, really smart. So moving on to before the meeting, preparing. This is all pretty intuitive, but again, it's helpful to have more people behind you going into a meeting, because it makes your MP feel that this is an issue that's cared about by many of their constituents, not just one. And I'm saying MP because it's easier, but like all the same principles apply to meetings with elected representatives at any level. I'm just going to say MP so I don't have to list all of them out every time. So recruit as much as you're able, pull from your existing networks, pull from organizations you're a part of, ask your neighbors to come. And not everyone has to be well-versed in the issue. Not everyone has to say something beyond introducing themselves, but really the more people in the room, the more powerful your presence. And then you're going to want to come up with a list of key talking points and an ask. Okay, so I say this should be specific and time-bound. It should be both those things, but then the scale of your ask is again going to depend on where your MP sits on that spectrogram that I showed you earlier. So if your MP has influence and is open to like hearing from you and potentially acting on what you ask of them, give them something that is actually like specific and tangibly useful and time-bound. If it's someone who has influence on your issue but is against you, like for example, a Christia Freeland, you don't have to be as specific. Like if the point of your meeting is to hurt their public reputation, you could go in with a stronger ask that you know they're not going to be able to fulfill, but that will make them look bad in the media. So again, thinking about the Climate Justice Toronto meeting with Carolyn Bennett, they knew she wasn't going to, condemn violence on Wet'suwet'en territory, but they knew that that was the most media-friendly ask to go into that meeting with. And then if you don't know what to say or to ask for, do some research. But there's lots of organizations that do really great policy work to help you come in armed with some knowledge on how to talk about an issue. But remember that you don't have to be a policy expert to speak with authority, and your MP is almost certainly not a policy expert either. So you don't have to be, and don't let that intimidate you if that's the thing that's holding you back from meeting with your MP on an issue. And then if possible before your meeting, I would also suggest meeting with your fellow attendees to prep and distribute speaking roles. Often you don't need everyone in your meeting to speak, like I said, but if you have 2 to 4 people who are really well versed in the talking points and who will lead the conversation, that's really helpful to anchor it. All right, and then at the meeting, you're going to want to introduce yourselves. Again, if you want to, if you're in the constituency, label that. If you're not, don't say it, or you can lie about it if you want to. So introduce yourselves, focus on connecting via shared values. So for many of you here, that might be the fact that you're parents, and you can talk about how that connects to climate or whatever issue you're meeting with your MP to discuss. Then you're going to want to listen to your representative. They'll likely introduce themselves. Listen for areas of agreement, but remember that by default, your MP will try to take up as much of your meeting time as possible, talking about themselves and their record and how they're already super good on the issue. So listen for areas of agreement that you can reference back to later, but don't let this become the focus of your meeting, because it's about you and what you have to bring. So once you've allowed your MP a little bit of a chance to talk about themselves, you're going to want to get into the issue. Again, don't try to be a policy expert. Also, don't assume that the representative is a policy expert. So figure out what those key points are that you need to get across, and then split those up between a few different attendees. And then as much as you can, connect those back to your values. Because again, you're there because you're a constituent who's invested in the outcome, not because you are a policy expert, although I am sure that some of you are, in fact. And then from there, you're going to want to make a clear ask. You're going to ask your MP to commit to taking an action, and then you're going to thank them and commit to a follow-up. And this is really important because your MP needs to know that you're going to hold them accountable, and then you need to follow through on that. All right. So some tips and tricks. I've said this already. Lead with values. Don't try to be an expert. Protect your time. Maybe just like drop an exclamation mark in the chat if you've ever had a conversation with an MP where like they took up more than 80% of the airtime. Yeah, MPs are super good at this. It's like their favorite thing, and it's so annoying. And so like feel really comfortable practicing your interruption skills, and make sure that you are giving yourselves the time to get across the points that you need to get across. Hold your ground, go in for the hard ask, and then this is a very specific like COVID learning. If you're meeting online, set up the meeting yourself. And I say this because if you have control of the meeting, it's going to be harder for your MP to leave unexpectedly. We had a volunteer during our emissions cap campaign whose MP set up the meeting and then just abruptly left at exactly 30 minutes. If you control the meeting, like the meeting link, you have a little bit more control over how and when the meeting ends. So make sure that you're in control. And then after the meeting, you're going to want to debrief with your team, figure out, what people's impressions were, what their learnings were. This is also just good organizing. If you're working with volunteers and you want them to come back, you want to make sure that they are really feeling like they've had a chance to process how the meeting went. It's also scary meeting with your MP, and if someone's doing it for the first time, that's definitely an experience that you want to like honor and make some time to process. Then you're going to want to make a plan to follow up. So send an email to your MP reiterating the commitments they made and the timeline that they said they would act on them. And then make sure that you follow up on that. So once the timeline has elapsed, make sure you follow up and ask if they've done it. And then depending on your strategy, you can also communicate out how the meeting went. You can post about it on social media. Depending on the scale, you could even engage in some traditional media, send out a press release about it, whatever you like, and whatever fits with your strategy. But make sure that you're using this meeting to your benefit as much as possible. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my rapid fire run through of how to host an MP meeting or an advocacy meeting. I'll just stop sharing my screen. And am I passing it back, Gabrielle? Where am I?
I think, yeah, we're going to do a little panel discussion, right, with Kate and Jennifer. And I think maybe are you comfortable leading that?
Yeah.
Kate, number one. Awesome.
Yes.
Great.
Awesome. Yeah. So Kate and Jennifer, I'm super excited to turn it back on you because the whole time I was presenting, I was just like aware of how much direct experience and brilliance you have with like running these meetings. So maybe what we can do is could you both just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the experience that you had, what the issue was that you were meeting with your elected representative to discuss, and who that elected representative was, and maybe I will pass to Kate first.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. I am Kate McMahon with For Our Kids in Burnaby, and actually I do not have a lot of experience. I've just sort of started doing this just in the last year, yeah. But I can talk a little bit about the experience I have had. My MP is Terry Beach, and so he is Christian Freeland's parliamentary secretary. He's a very smooth talker and a very friendly guy, and he will tell you exactly what he thinks you want to hear. But we organized a rally in front of his office for the Just Transition last year, and invited him. So I think our focus with our relationship with him is really building a relationship and understanding more about where he stands on these issues and what his barriers are, and how we can just know more about him in that sense. But we had the rally. He came. He was very much for the Just Transition. We followed up with the petition, which he ultimately did not present. Gave us all sorts of excuses because he is the parliamentary secretary, so it would be a conflict of interest, which is not entirely true. He could have made a better effort in that sense. But we followed up a few months later with an emissions cap conversation. We worked through the Climate Action Alliance, and they provided a lot of the similar tools that Leadnow, I think, is doing, just how to talk to them and sort of what to ask for. So a few of us got together and had a very good conversation with him. He would not commit to the 60% reduction that we were asking for, but did try to convince us that he was the greenest guy in the party and he was doing everything he could. And if he could get us to 100% reductions, he would do it. But there were barriers. So we're sort of looking more at finding out what those barriers are, and the political, the costing, understanding how the numbers need to balance. And those are the areas that he's particularly interested in. So it's a good conversation. We're going to follow up again with another one. And then he did extend an invitation to me to come to one of his Liberal fundraising events, so I could hear more firsthand all the good things they are doing. So he invited me, and introduced me to Stephen Guilbeault, which was nice. So I was able to ask him a few questions about the emissions cap and about what activists should be working on, where our focus should be now. So it was very sort of new for me meeting with him and just understanding how to build that relationship. And I think because he is positioning himself as a climate champion, we're going to be working more on collaborating and how can we help remove barriers for him in that sense. And then we will be meeting with him again as we learn more and more about sort of what the emissions cap regulations are looking for and where there's sort of points of persuasion would be most effective. But yeah, so that's my limited experience with MPs. I've got a little bit more with city councillors. And then but that's also it's been interesting. Getting to know especially new councillors has been effective who don't know anything yet, and getting to meet them as they're introducing them to the issues. And then we're starting to become a source of information for them so they can sound like they know what they're talking about in some of the meetings when they don't have experience yet in these areas.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And that sounds like there's lots in there that would be interesting to dig into, especially meeting with an MP who purports to be kind of farther along that spectrum toward being on your side, but then doesn't actually commit to the follow through, and then how you like continue to hold them accountable. So I'm super excited to dig into that more. And before we do, I'll pass it on to Jennifer, and I'd love if you could just share the same. What were you advocating for? Who did you meet with? And maybe a little bit about what the outcome of that was.
Sure. Hold on, I've got to close something. Okay. I'm also going to talk about Just Transition. So last year, we met with the MP for Outremont, Rachel Bendayan. She's a Liberal MP. to discuss the Just Transition petition and ask her to present that in the House of Commons. So what's interesting about this particular scenario was that it was actually her who requested to meet with us, just to sort of take a pulse of what was happening within the environmental movement. We sort of suspect that this was before, I guess, the cabinet positions were sort of doled out, and she thought that maybe like it's possible she could have been parliamentary secretary for the environment. So she just wanted to be up to date on the files. And so because of our previous experience with her, we sort of came to mind as people who know what's going on in the environment and what regular people care about in the environment. So so our members of For Our Kids Montreal, we've been building this relationship with this MP for the past 3 years. We actually met with her for the first time before COVID, just before. And we requested to meet with her over the Teck oil sands mine in 2020. And since then, we also requested meetings about the Climate Accountability Act. And she doesn't actually have any power herself on these files, but she's actually very good at sort of seeing where the needs are and sort of where she can influence. So she actually set up meetings with our team with MPs who were on that the Environmental Standing Committee. And this led to us being able to present the Voice of Parents Across Canada for Bill C-12. Unfortunately, Kelly, who was actually the person who did this presentation, couldn't be here to sort of talk about her experience there because she is a busy ER doctor. So this sort of led to our MP feeling that, we have a sense of what's going on with people concerned for the environment, and we were on the list of people to call for this sort of thing. And so we presented this petition to her. She was very sort of on side. She sort of presented herself that way. She's also a mom. We have daughters of a similar age. And she did present it in the House of Commons and was among the first to do that. So that was a win on our part. And at that meeting, I did share with her some personal stories as to why this particular issue was important to me. Like, I feel that's an important thing that people can bring to meetings like this, and why other parents might find this to be important, like just transition. Like, why do we care about that? We don't necessarily work in oil and gas. And since then, she actually invited a number of us to a round table with Stephen Guilbeault, just some of her constituents with Stephen Guilbeault, where we could ask him direct questions, and that was pretty cool.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so interesting to hear from the flip side the story of an MP who you were able to make into an ally, and who then was able to give you access in some really useful ways. So yeah, very excited to dig into that more. And then I will pass it to our final panelist, Anne. And Anne, same question for you. If you could just tell us a little bit about what you were advocating for and how you approached your politician, and a little bit about the outcome.
Sure, thanks. So I'm sort of thinking back to the Bill C-12 organizing, which became the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And the For Our Kids team here in Toronto and across Canada were really active in pushing for a really strong, would have been nice if we were even stronger, but we did in the end secure a somewhat stronger Net Zero Emissions Act. So we met with, well, I had a meeting with not Chrystia Freeland, but with her constituency person, and that was a good meeting, and it did start a relationship with him. So I have continued to write to him on issues, and now that we are trying to secure a meeting on the emissions cap, I do feel that good relationship with him has got him on side in pressing for an in-person meeting with Chrystia Freeland. So I know from other groups here in Toronto that, and as you said, it's really hard to get a meeting with someone as busy as Chrystia Freeland, who is in her position. So having a good relationship with him, I think, has been helpful in that he has previously said, no, it's not possible. And now he has, in fact, sent on our request to her scheduling team. We also met as members of For Our Kids Toronto with ministers who were on the standing committee when it came to Bill C-12. In particular, I'm thinking of a meeting we had with Yara Sachs, who was the Liberal MP in York Centre. And that was also an opportunity for us to educate her. I know from other members of For Our Kids, sometimes it's surprising, well, it shouldn't be surprising, how kind of not really so well informed some of our MPs are about the urgency of the climate crisis. So she was touting her willingness to do, recycling. And I was like, okay, it's a bigger issue than that. So we did have a slide presentation for her. We really hit home the point on the difference between 1.5 and 2. And she did come out of that meeting, I felt, with a stronger understanding of the urgency of really making this Bill C-12 as strong as it possibly could be. And our ask of her was to support having climate scientists appear as witnesses to the standing committee, so that there was an opportunity there to further educate all the MPs on that committee.
Thanks so much, Anne. This is so interesting because I feel like we have the story of Jennifer, your MP, who was like a very willing ally, and who you made into a stronger ally, and who gave you lots of access in useful ways to other Liberal MPs. And then we have the story of Terry Beach and your experience with that, Kate, where he says that he's a climate champion and is the greenest MP you'll ever meet, and then it's really hard to get him to commit to anything. And then Anne, with the story of Chrystia Freeland, having an MP who is just stonewalling, not going to move. So it's interesting that we have this whole range of how our MPs are willing to interact with us, and how strategies shift based on how those MPs kind of position themselves on the issue. So I would love to ask, generally, and especially in light of those different contexts, what would you say are the top learnings from those meetings that you would share with other parents? And especially because I think you represent such a wide range of experiences you might have with your MP, speaking from your own experience, what you would suggest for people who might be trying to host a meeting with someone who has, with an MP who has a similar orientation or outlook. And Kate, I might just pass back to you.
Yeah, so I think probably my biggest takeaway, and this is, so I'm very new to this, I get very nervous talking to them. So I think understanding that they are just regular people too. They're just parents. And as you're saying, that they're not policy experts, most of them. And so we don't have to be either. So being authentic and I say the wrong thing, but just being myself as well, just getting that out there, I think is and building that relationship and as a human to human, and so that you feel comfortable asking them questions or emailing them, and building that relationship with their staff as well, as Anne was talking to. I think that's been very valuable. I think one point of potential leverage that our group has had is that we worked with a lot of other local groups during elections, doing a report card. It was for the municipal elections, but sort of putting that out there, we can do that for the federal as well. So I think Terry wants us on side. So he's interested in our group and us supporting him. So I think that's why I probably got the invitation to this event. He's a dad with 2 young kids as well. So I think he's interested in having us appear as allies and supporters of him. So obviously we need to be careful, but I think building that relationship in that way has been useful for us so far.
Thanks so much, Kate. Yeah, lots of love in the chat for being authentic and going in nervous, but then playing to your strengths and your humanity. Jennifer, can I pass the same question to you?
Sure. My top 3 learnings are not all that different from what Kate has said and what, well, the other Kate has said. So really, as parents who don't do environmental advocacy as their day job, it can be easy to dismiss ourselves and say, well, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, who is going to take me seriously? And this is where we would be wrong. As parents, we are experts in what's best for our kids. And we know that a future where the climate crisis devastates the planet, which is, where we're heading now, is not what's best for our kids. So it's not up to us to provide all the solution. And it's their job to sort of look to the experts and do what needs to be done. And Kate is right. They're not experts either. So you may find that you're actually teaching them something, and they want your vote. So you shouldn't be afraid to tell them what they need to do to get it. In addition, building that relationship is also super important. If something is important to you, send a personal email, ask for a meeting. If you want to discuss something, give their office a call. And keep trying until they agree. And if you see them in the street, say hi. Many are also parents, and this is something that you have in common with them. And you can, even though we're not experts, you should still go in prepared, like do some research, prepare your talking points. What's your story? Why do you care about this? You don't need to be an expert, but you can provide examples of what other experts say. And for our kids and other groups such as Leadnow or 350 often have like great tools that can help us do this.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That made me a little weepy. And yeah, I think the piece around parents being experts in what's best for your kids. I think that's like that's what gives you authority, is the personal stories that you bring. And so, yeah, just a fat +1 to that. And Anne, I will pass it to you next for the same question.
Yeah, just agreeing with everyone here. You don't have to be an expert, and you bring your passion and your deep concern for the future, over which they have huge decision-making power, to these meetings, and conveying that rests on them, I think, is important. In the case of Chrystia Freeland, we have been doing some more, not to make this meeting all about her, but we have been doing some strategizing. So with this group, because she's in University of Rosedale, I am bringing in other experts. So University of Rosedale includes the University of Toronto, and my husband happens to teach there, and we've been pulling in a lot of the academics who work on climate-related topics across all the disciplines to this meeting. And one of our other constituents happens to also work for environmental defense, Ali Rougeau. And so we were able to get Ali Rougeau to give us, and with some of the other people from environmental defense, to give us a great briefing on what to really push for with Chrystia Freeland. So if you do have access to experts who might be able to give you a bit more information about how to present yourself to your MP, that's helpful. In this particular case, they really emphasized she's been shying away from climate, but now as with changes in the US in the Inflation Reduction Act, she's starting to shift. And so they really emphasized that Canada's climate future depends on her decisions, and to hang that on her, but also to present this as an opportunity for her to display leadership, because that's another, like, some flattery in there can also be helpful. We want you to show leadership on this issue. There are all these opportunities here for you. I've been thinking of ways in which we could invite her to events at the University of Toronto, give her opportunities to shine in ways that she hasn't before. And So some of that flattery, I think, and opportunities can also help move a politician, depending, of course, on where they are on that spectrum. So yeah, that's my that's where I'm currently at. I feel like I'm still very much in the learning how to do this stage, but have been learning a lot too. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
I just want to jump in there for a sec. I have one last little tip. You could also ask your MP, especially if they're on your side, what you can do to help them get there. This is something that I've heard a lot from Stephen Guilbeault, that like, we need to keep doing what we're doing to move the needle. Like he worked at Equiterre and Greenpeace. He's very much on side, but he only has certain tools available to him to like push the government in the right direction. So you can ask them how we can help them get there. We also had some meetings with Quebec politicians who were in opposition, and asked them how we can help, move the majority, that sort of thing. So I think that's also, it's not necessarily just about asking them what they can do for us, but it's also what we can do for them as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's so brilliant, and I think points to a bigger piece of this, which is that MP meetings are part of a larger strategy, and often need to happen in conjunction with mass movements that are ramping up the pressure and showing elected representatives that they have to take a stance on an issue. So they fit into a larger strategy, and I think that's such sound advice. To ask your MP what you can do to help them get there and help them be a champion on your issue. So I think that brings us to the end of our panel discussion, and I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who shared your experience and your wisdom. I'm going to pass it back to Gabrielle, who I think is going to be facilitating the Q&A.
Thank you so much to the three of you and to you, Kate. That was super interesting. We do have a few questions in the chat that maybe people could say if there's a particular person they want to ask it to, or we could put it to the panel. But I think the first person who had a question was Meg, and she wanted to explain it out loud. So go for it, Meg.
Thank you. I was so Gabriel and I are working on a campaign about climate aligned finance, and it's a bill that is being presented by a senator in Senate. It's actually not on the House side, which is weird. So now we're lobbying people that nobody voted for. Okay, so that's weird. But one of the things, we had a really wonderful, we connected with a member of the senator's office who's presenting this bill, who was super frank about everything, so helpful. And one thing she said that kind of blew my mind is that anybody with like an affiliation to the Liberals won't push anything that will embarrass Justin Trudeau, which that was surprising to me, that our prime minister is so fragile. However, that's the game we're playing. I'm just curious. I think it was Kate McMahon was talking about roadblocks, like these political roadblocks that politicians face. How would you advise somebody who's trying to get around not wanting to embarrass Justin Trudeau? Like, how would that look for you? How would you respond to that kind of boundary, or rather, I should say, barrier? Oh, who am I asking? I don't know. Anyone who wants to answer. Yeah, Kate Hodgson, I saw you unmute. If you want to go ahead, go for it.
I can say a thing, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. So I was just going to say, one of the biggest barriers that I've noticed in meeting, especially with Liberal MPs, is that the party line is upheld like really tightly, and the party whip does a lot to control what MPs can say and how. And then also, what you'll often experience is a reticence from Liberal MPs to say anything if they're not sure if they're allowed to say it or not. So with the emissions cap, what we found is, there's no reason that MPs can't like commit to advocating for a higher emissions cap or I guess a lower emissions cap, a more ambitious emissions cap, but they just don't know the policy well enough, and so out of an overabundance of caution, they will hesitate to, make the commitment. And so one strategy that we found is, alleviating the anxiety by doing the research for them, and saying like, this isn't something that the Liberal Party has a policy on yet, blah, blah, blah. But then the other is showing them that if they do a courageous thing, you'll have their back, which I think ties into what Jennifer was saying about asking them what they need to, be a champion on your issue. So making sure that, if their fear is hurting their position in the party, getting disciplined by the whip, that you are giving them the courage they need. And often that comes through strength in numbers. So if you can say, hey, we've actually met with like 20 MPs or like 5 MPs on this issue, and they've all said that, they would be willing to fight for this if they weren't the only one. Like, think about how you can kind of, or you can say, we know that this many people in our riding are really deeply concerned about this issue. Whatever you can do to kind of give them a little bit of a safety blanket, it'll make it easier for them to, risk Trudeau's precious, precious ego.
Any other thoughts on that? We can also move on to the next question. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, we had someone ask, to what degree do you think the federal Liberals are reluctant to move faster or bolder on climate because it risks them losing power in the next election? That's the narrative I've been told from MLAs in the BC NDP, that they risk losing to the Liberals if they move too fast on climate before the public is ready to accept that. So any thoughts on that kind of discourse when you meet with people and how to manage that? So do any parents have experience with that, or how they've? I'm sure that's a common talking point. Hey?
So you actually see this a lot, like an NDP government happens and they're seen as being too far to the left, even though they're really trying to balance center, and then they lose in the next election. It happened in Nova Scotia not that long ago. So like, this is a legitimate fear that they have. To counter it, I'm not sure I have a full, complete answer to that, but I think that if you can express to them that there is a not vocal majority who do see climate as being super important, and that if they're willing to show courage, that these people will stand up and vote for them. I think that's one way you can play it.
Yeah, I would second that. And I think the only thing I would add is our job as social movements, as members of social movements, is to show that the public is ahead of the party, and then force the party to chase us. And I think that's like the forever challenge, especially with the NDP, is that their political power comes from being able to shift discourse to the left and force the Liberals to follow them. And they fundamentally don't understand that a lot of the time. And so it's our job to remind them that it's their job to have courage, and to make a difference while they are in power. And the more we can show them that their constituents and the public are ready for them to have courage, the more we can kind of open up political space for them to do that. But it is, a source of constant frustration for myself, and I'm sure for all of you, that our progressive governments are sometimes the least confident in like taking political risks.
Go for it, Anne. You have something to add?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been thinking about it, and I've got conflicting advice on, is addressing the lobbying influence of the fossil fuel industry. I don't know how many of you follow on Twitter the federal, what is it called? The Federal Lobby Bot, which reports every time the fossil fuel industry meets with an MP or a particular ministry, and they are absolutely relentless, and they have access that we don't, and that is super concerning. They are really so much able to influence the narrative and provide their well-oiled talking points to politicians, and in particular to Chrystia Freeland and all of them really across the board. So bringing that up, I've received advice not to, because in our case that will put her on the defensive, but others have thought, make it clear that our politicians are responsible to us, to the constituents, to the people of Canada. So I'm just curious if that's come up in any conversations to specifically address the incredible lobbying power of that industry, not be silent on it, because it is so powerful. Kate, interested in your thoughts, or if anyone else has any experience in bringing that up.
I was waiting to see if the other Kate would come off mute. That's such a tough one, because in one respect, we're never going to be able to match the volume of lobbying that the fossil fuel industry undertakes every year. And so there's a battle of attrition that we're not necessarily going to win, but that we can still engage in. It is useful for us to meet with our MPs and to remind them that we're the ones they're accountable to, not the fossil fuel industry. And then the other piece is just going back to that piece around how MP meetings fit in with the work of the larger movement. It's our job to not only meet with our MPs and provide them with a counter narrative, but also to villainize the fossil fuel industry, to reveal the depths to which the fossil fuel industry has captured our political leaders, and to build public outrage about that. And so, I think we can all figure out what our role in that project is, and MP meetings are one important piece of the puzzle, where we're directly countering the lobbying that these MPs are receiving. And also there's a broader piece of work that has to do with undermining the power of the fossil fuel industry and forcing our elected officials to kind of sever that bond in order to protect their reputations and their electability. Which isn't a very helpful answer. I don't know if there's a silver bullet.
Thanks so much, and Kate. I just want to acknowledge we're at 1:13 now. I think we'll take a couple more questions. People can drop off if they need to, and we are recording this and we'll be sharing it. But I had a question that came in the chat for Kate from Burnaby about taking opportunities to meet with elected officials outside of formal meetings. So what's the role of that? Going to things like a fundraiser like you did, or other times when politicians are clearly spouting their own party line? What is helpful about taking opportunities like this, and are there any things to kind of be aware of, would you say?
I think for this Liberal event that I went to, it was interesting to go to, just because they were speaking much more candidly. And I think once they're at their sort of amongst their friends, you do get a little bit more off script conversation. And I mean, my experience in this is very limited as well, but they recognize very clearly how far behind we were from the US now with the Inflation Reduction Act, which I don't think they've really stressed that publicly. So we are really working hard to get caught up. They did talk about how tight the budget is going to be this year, but that is one of the focuses is going to be catching up with the US in terms of manufacturing and supply chains, and so that we can stay competitive. So I think and then just having that more personal conversations, being able to ask the personal questions, and just meeting face to face, and understand that they're helping you and you're helping them, and that it is all a bit of a game. But I think I had a lot of people warning me about going to this event as well. They were going to throw me into a table full of industry lobbyists that were going to eat me alive and everything, but that didn't happen. And I did end up sitting right next to a red Tory who had moved over to support the Liberals because of their great environmental plans. And he was worried about where he's going to ski after the snow melts at Whistler, but that was enough to bring him over to support the Liberals, because he thinks they are going to be the ones to do this. So just understanding different perspectives and who is there and why they're there, I found very valuable anyways.
I wonder, is it okay for us to go to events that are like, it's a fundraiser for Liberals? Is that seen as being partisan? Does that make you like seen as being a Liberal or supporting Liberals? This is more of a question for, like, I guess Kate or any of the For Our Kids people.
I personally would super endorse this, and I agree with Kate that it's some of the most effective lobbying I've ever done. I have gone to actions where I've like pretended to be a Liberal supporter and used that as my in. Also, a close neighbor to MP meetings and lobbying is bird dogging, and trying to get an MP or an elected official to say something on camera that you can hold them to later. Immediately after the 2019 federal election, a group of friends and I went to the NDP election night party, and we got Jagmeet Singh to commit on camera to fighting for a Green New Deal. And it can be a really effective way to get an MP to commit to something that you can then hold them to later. So I think it depends on your own comfort level and your own moral compass. If you have any qualms about, presenting yourself in a partisan way when you're not a partisan or whatever else. But just a big plus one to what Kate said about like finding those spaces where elected officials have their guard down. It can be really effective.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'm a supporter of climate champions. And if Terry Beach is going to prove to me that he is a climate champion, then yeah, I can support him. So I think like if you're called on your partisanship or like we're climate champions, and that's how we sort of did the report card for the counselors as well. It wasn't any one party, but it was supporting climate champions.
Thanks so much to the Kates. And I see note from our a member of team here too. There's level of personal discernment involved with this kind of decision. So maybe it's how you frame it. You maybe wouldn't take a photo and splash them on social media with that person in that kind of endorsement way, but there can be ways to be in those spaces and get some really useful information. So trusting your judgment about how to approach that. I don't know if there's any other questions. I guess my final question was kind of around that follow-up piece and the public versus more kind of confidential conversations. Like, what is the role of following up with these people after you speak to them? If they commit to something, how do you hold them accountable? And are there concerns if you are to sort of share on social media or try and make a lot of noise about the fact that they haven't done that? Like, are those relationships delicate? Is that worth worrying about? Or is it important to kind of just really be public and try and get more people involved and hold these actors accountable? Like, how do you, I guess it probably depends on the relationship, but I was wondering if anyone could speak to that in this group, if that question was clear. Any thoughts?
I think there's something about criticizing the policy and not the person. Like, that is also how you can, support a politician's policy without being seen as being partisan. So like attack what they've committed to or failed to commit to, but not attack them as a person.
Any other thoughts on that? No, okay. One last question, and then I think we'll wrap it up here. So how do we deal with increasing public mistrust of government making sweeping policy moves when we need these kind of policy moves to address climate quickly and adequately? Any thoughts on that?
Oof. I have a thought on this, which is that we do need like big government intervention in order to address the climate crisis at scale. And it sucks that we're in this moment where public mistrust of government intervention is so high, and also it's very obvious why that is the case. It's because government has failed us like so many times, especially in moments where courage and ambition and scale was needed. But our job is to like show the public and show politicians that that kind of intervention at scale is what's needed. And again, I feel like I'm sounding a bit like a broken record, but I think that is like a movement-wide responsibility and shouldn't all, rest on how we conduct ourselves in MP meetings. It has to do with the kinds of solutions we fight for and how we frame them, and how we talk about climate alongside economic equality and injustice. But yeah, I think it is like a really core challenge because we are in this moment where we need intervention from government, and also where everyone is just watching government fail us over and over again. And so there's this like horrible catch-22, which is that we need to increase public faith in government and then force government to, be worthy of that faith.
Just one other thought on that. I mean, not that it directly addresses the question of public mistrust in government, but when meeting with MPs and trying to explain to MPs, to show courage and see what can be done, with Bill C-12, it was very useful to bring in examples from what other governments are doing around the world where policies had been successful. So I think that is another narrative tool here that can be useful. So the UK, surprisingly, but other countries in Europe had dramatically reduced their emissions through very strong climate accountability laws. So being able to, and on the municipal level, I often think about the good work being done through the C40 network of cities who are acting on climate change. So bringing in those other examples is a way to show that government can still do good things, and we need that in the public interest, and you need to be advocates for the public interest. So that's just one other thought on that topic.
I'll just add to that celebrating wins too, when they do good work and they do make strong plans, to celebrate them and congratulate them and make sure to how is this going to benefit us, and show the benefit, show how people are already benefiting from these plans or policies.
Thanks everyone. Yeah, I think those are great points to remember, right? What are the stakes of this, and how do we kind of make sure that we're moving in the right direction as quickly as possible and celebrate those wins and build on them. I think that we're at time. That was super interesting and very useful. Thank you so much to Kate from Leadnow, and Kate and Anne and Jennifer. Really appreciate you sharing all your experiences. This will be shared with all who registered and on our website for those who might want to refer to it. And please reach out if you have any more questions or want to take on this work.